This is from Paul's epistle to the Romans in chapter 8, verses 5 through 11. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. For this reason, the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. And those who are in the flesh cannot please God. But you are not in the flesh. You are in the Spirit, since the Spirit of God dwells in you. Anyone who does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him. But if Christ is in you, though the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. If the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also, through his Spirit that dwells in you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I want to talk about some of the spiritual dimensions of the pandemic, the crisis that's in front of us right now. I want us to see how spiritual tools, spiritual things, can actually help us cope with this physical, natural crisis and disaster. For instance, suppose, as a matter of choice, as a matter of will, as a matter of decision on the part of individuals, and individuals cooperating together, all of us were to freeze in place for the 14 to 15 days that we've been asked to do. We might have to take 3 days before we started to make sure everyone's got enough food in their houses, but freeze in place. By freeze in place, I mean nobody has contact with any other person they're not already in contact with. Now, we wouldn't be able to do this perfectly. This is a thought experiment. We wouldn't be able to do this perfectly in the situation we have right now. But as a thought experiment, suppose we did. Then 15 days from now, we would have a large supply of people that we knew were free of the virus, did not have it, even without any testing to ascertain that. And those people could be freed to go about doing the necessary things to take care of the rest of us. Those few people who had to be wandering around during the first 15-day period could now go into isolation because other people would be able to take over for them. Not only that, but we would have checked, blocked the spread of the virus almost entirely just by an act of will and without even having to develop a vaccine. So what I want us to see is that there are choices we can make, decisions we can make, spiritual things, not physical things or biological things, that can have an effect on the present crisis, even without testing kits or a vaccine. We've been advised to learn social distancing. Suppose we had social distance shields like in a science fiction novel, that blocked things off at a certain distance and kept them from moving back and forth, kept them from coming across the barrier at us. I mean, I've read science fiction novels and there are things like this. They all have certain controls, they have certain limitations, but they have certain powers. Suppose we had them, we could turn them on, our social distance shields, to protect us as we stir around and see one another. We can do the same thing, totally by acts of will and decision and choice and action, by acquiring skills in the exercise of our wills, by learning to pay attention, by always knowing how far away we are from every person around us, by knowing where we're going, where they're going, having paid attention to who they are and what they're up to, as well as knowing what we're about to do. We could, just by training ourselves to it, by a totally spiritual action, develop that social distance so that it was just as firm and just as strong as if we had a science fiction device clipped to our belts to provide a shield for us. it would require cooperation. It would require paying attention to one another. It would require communication with one another. It would require a determined will, an intention to do it, always and ever, an intention to exercise sufficient attention and sufficient thought to make it work. But if we did, then we could accomplish something really remarkable in terms of developing a social distance shield that really works. Again, I'm not trying to give medical advice here, nor advice about how to deal with a pandemic as a society. I'm trying to get us to notice how the spiritual dimensions of this problem can be addressed with spiritual solutions during the time in which physical solutions are not yet available to us. We all need to do the practice necessary to develop active, accurate, thoughtful, and skillful social distance shields, because we're going to need them, not just now, but again in the future. We're going to have to be able to tune our social distance shields so that even if we get past the worst of things right now, we'll still be able to set them at a lower level, but with a certain resilience for the next several months afterwards. Social distance will have to be something that we practice most of the time or in most situations, even if we don't have to practice it all the time. But we won't be able to practice it at that lower level if we haven't learned first how to practice it at this higher level now. It's a thing that we can develop as a matter of spirit, as a matter of choice, as a matter of will, as a matter of action, by our decisions. This is what Christian faith is all about. It's about what we do with our wills. It's about our choices. It's about our decisions. It's about our actions. It starts in a garden where our decisions are put under a certain pressure and we choose not to trust God. And the whole story since then is about coping with that choice and developing ways that God can help us to make new and better and different choices again. The Christian faith is not primarily about gaining access to a certain group of miracles. It's primarily about who we are, what we choose, and what we're going to do. And it's about a brokenness in our ability to make good choices and the way that God is healing that brokenness. That's why I want us to pay attention to the spiritual dimensions of this pandemic and of the skills that we have to develop to deal with it. The connections that will allow us to keep a certain tension in social distance between us, those connections are based upon do unto others as you would have them do unto you. They're based upon love your neighbor as yourself. That do unto others as you would have them do unto you is the cooperative element that's necessary to keep social distances. That love your neighbor as you love yourself is the part that keeps us apart, knowing that they have to be careful of us as we have to be careful of them. There are all kinds of elements to our faith about how we treat one another, how we love one another, how we live together with one another, that go into developing good, skillful, accurate social distance shields. And we can and should learn to practice them and learn to practice them now. The problem of our will and our choices, our decisions and our actions all starts with a matter of trust. I've given the sermon before about the origin of sin in the garden and pointed out that the problem at its root was a failure of trust. We fell when we no longer trusted God. The specific act of disobedience, eating of the fruit of a certain tree, that was just the concrete form of it. The essence of it was a failure of trust. And if we don't trust God, how are we going to trust one another? And I want us to notice right now, right here, in the midst of this problem, this crisis, how lack of trust between human beings has made the whole thing worse. How lack of trust between human beings has caused problems with it. How its startup was concealed by lack of trust. How its spread here in the United States has been worse than it should have been, because we haven't trusted one another from the start, because the president didn't trust his advisors, because we didn't trust one another to keep distance, because we didn't trust one another to share resources. Our failure to trust one another is going to make this pandemic worse than it would have been otherwise. We won't be able to do what I suggested at the beginning, freeze in place almost every last one of us, because we don't trust one another to do that. We don't trust that we'll be taken care of. We don't trust that food will be delivered to us. We don't trust that we will get what we want. The whole problem of the hoarding of necessary medical supplies is based upon a lack of trust. The whole issue of who will get what from the government, and the governors of states and the president have been fighting with one another about who gets to control medical supplies. That's a spiritual problem, not a physical problem. Maybe we don't have all the ventilators we should have yet, and we need to build more. Probably we do. But sharing the ones we have, and even developing what we need to develop in order to build more, these aren't a problem where the steel comes from. These aren't a problem where the manufacturing facilities come from. All of those things already exist. These are a problem of whether or not we are going to trust one another, and whether or not we're going to cooperate, and whether or not we're going to cooperate with an attitude of love and of doing for the other person as we would want done unto us. Those are the things that are preventing the ventilators from being built and preventing the ventilators from being distributed. Those are the things that are preventing the medical supplies and the protection equipment for getting to the hospitals. There's nothing in the genetic pattern of this virus that stops human beings from sharing fairly and trustingly. This whole virus, this pandemic, this is a spiritual crisis, as well as a biological crisis, as well as a physical crisis. And if we don't get a grip on that and recognize that our faith is teaching us how to be the kinds of human beings who can trust one another and can work together lovingly for one another, if we can't do that, then the pandemic is going to be worse than it needs to be. Amen.